statement on the Cabinet Secretary's report on the Indian operation at Sri Harmandir, also called the Golden Temple in Amritsar in June of 1984. The House will recall that on the 13th of January, concerns were raised regarding two documents released to the public in the National Archives. The documents relate to the painful events that followed the occupation of the temple site by Sikh dissidents in December of 1983, which led to a 6-month standoff with the Indian authorities. In June of 1984, a 3-day military operation by Indian forces, known as Operation Blue Star, took place. Official Indian government figures estimate that 575 people died. Other reports suggest that as many as 3,000 people were killed, including pilgrims caught in the crossfire. This loss of life was an utter tragedy. Understandably, members of the Sikh community around the world still feel the pain and suffering caused by these events. Given this, we fully understand the concerns raised by the two documents. They indicated in February 1984, in the early stages of the crisis, the then British government sent a military officer to give advice to the Indian government about their contingency planning. Many in this House and the whole country rightly wish to know what connection, if any, there had been between this giving of advice and the tragic events at Amritsar over 3 months later. Within hours of the documents coming to light, the Prime Minister instructed the Cabinet Secretary to carry out an urgent investigation in 4 critical areas. Why advice was provided to the Indian authorities, what the nature of that advice was, what impact it had on Operation Blue Star, and whether Parliament was misled. The Cabinet Secretary was not asked to investigate Operation Blue Star itself, or the actions of the Indian government, or other events relating to the Sikh community in India. While the Cabinet Secretary has investigated these specific matters, I can make clear that during his investigation, no circumstantial evidence has been offered or has surfaced of UK involvement in any subsequent military operations in the Punjab. This investigation has been rigorous and thorough. The Cabinet Secretary and officials have met Sikh organisations to ensure that their concerns informed the investigation. They have spoken to individuals associated with the two documents, although some officials are now deceased. They have examined Hansard records from 1984 to the present day, and they have carried out an extensive and thorough search of the files held by all relevant departments and agencies from December 1983 to June of 1984. Their search through some 200 files and some 23,000 documents found a very limited number of documents relating to Operation Blue Star. The report notes that some military files covering various operations were destroyed in November of 2009 as part of a routine process undertaken by the Ministry of Defence at the 25-year review point. This included one file on the provision of military advice to the Indian authorities on their contingency plans for Sri Harmandir Sahib. However, copies of at least some of the documents in the destroyed files were also in other departmental files, and taken together these files provide a consistent picture of what happened. The Cabinet Secretary's investigation is now complete. Copies of the report have been placed in the libraries of both houses, and it is now being published on the government website. The report includes the publication of the relevant sections of 5 extra documents that shed light on this period, but which would not normally have been published. We have taken this step because the whole investigation has been based on a commitment to the maximum possible transparency. We want to be as open as possible with the British public, insofar as that does not undermine the principle upheld by successive British governments of not revealing any information relating to intelligence or special forces. The main findings of the Cabinet Secretary's report are as follows. First, on why the UK provided advice to the Indian government. The Cabinet Secretary has established that in early February 1984, the then government received an urgent request to provide operational advice on Indian contingency plans for action to regain control of the temple complex. The British High Commission in India recommended that the government respond positively to the request for bilateral assistance from a country with which we had an important relationship. This advice was accepted by the then government. Second, the Cabinet Secretary then examined the nature of the advice that was provided to India following that decision. He has established that a single British military advisor travelled to India between the 8th and the 17th of February 1984 to advise the Indian intelligence services and special group on contingency plans that they were drawing up for operations against armed dissidents in the temple complex, including ground reconnaissance of the site. The advisor's assessment made clear that a military operation should only be put into effect as a last resort, when all attempts at negotiation had failed. It recommended including in any operation an element of surprise and the use of helicopter-borne forces in the interest of reducing casualties and bringing about a swift resolution. This giving of military advice was not repeated. The documents show that the decision to provide advice was based on an explicit recommendation to ministers that the government should not contemplate assistance beyond the visit of the military advisor, and this was reflected in his instructions. The Cabinet Secretary found no evidence in the files or from discussions with officials involved that any other form of UK military assistance, such as equipment or training, was given to the Indian authorities. The Cabinet Secretary's report therefore concludes that the nature of the UK's assistance was purely advisory, limited and provided to the Indian government at an early stage in their planning. Third, the report examines what actual impact UK advice had on the Indian operation, which took place between the 5th and the 7th of June 1984, over 3 months later. The report establishes that during that period, the planning by the Indian authorities had changed significantly. The number of dissident forces was considerably larger by that time, and the fortifications inside the site were more extensive. The documents also record information provided by the Indian Intelligence Coordinator that after the UK military advisor's visit in February, the Indian Army took over lead responsibility for the operation and the main concept behind the operation changed. The Cabinet Secretary's report includes an analysis by current military staff of the extent to which the actual operation in June 1984 differed from the approach recommended in February by the UK military advisor. Operation Blue Star was a ground assault, without the element of support and without a helicopter-borne element. The Cabinet Secretary's report therefore concludes that the UK military officer's advice had limited impact on Operation Blue Star. This is consistent with a public statement on the 15th of January of this year by the Operation Commander, Lieutenant General Barr, who said that no one helped us in our planning or in the execution of the planning. It is also consistent with an exchange of letters between Mrs. Gandhi and Mrs. Thatcher on the 14th and 29th of June 1984 discussing the operation, which made no reference to any UK assistance. Those parts of the letter relevant to Operation Blue Star are published with the Cabinet Secretary's report today. The Cabinet Secretary has also examined two other concerns raised in this House and by the Sikh community, namely that Parliament may have been misled or that the decision to provide advice may have been linked to UK commercial interests. The report finds no evidence to substantiate either of these allegations. The investigation did not find any evidence in the files or from officials of the provision of UK military advice being linked to potential defence or helicopter sales or to any other policy or commercial issue. There is no evidence that the UK at any level attempted to use the fact that military advice had been given on request to advance any commercial objective. The only UK request of the Indian government made following the visit was for prior warning of any actual operation so that UK authorities could make appropriate security arrangements in London. In the event, the UK received no warning from the Indian authorities before the operation was launched. The Cabinet Secretary also concludes that there is no evidence of Parliament being misled. There is no record of a specific question to ministers about practical British support for Operation Blue Star, and he concludes that the one instance of a written question for ministers related to discussions with the Indian government on behalf of the Sikh community after the operation. In sum, the Cabinet Secretary's report finds that the nature of the UK's assistance was purely advisory, limited and provided to the Indian government at an early stage, that it had limited impact on the tragic events that unfolded at the temple 3 months later, that there was no link between the provision of this advice and defence sales, and that there is no record of the government receiving advance notice of the operation. Nonetheless, we are keen to discuss concerns raised by the Sikh community. The Minister responsible for relations with India, my right honourable friend the Minister for East Devon, will discuss these with Sikh organisations when he meets them later today. This reflects the strong positive relationship this government has with the British Sikh community, which plays such a positive role in so many areas of our national life. We are also determined to look at the wider issue raised by these events, about the management and release of information held by government under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, The 30-year rule has been suspended by a 20-year rule, so that from 2022 all annual releases will be after 20 years. However, it is not clear at the moment that this change is being approached in a uniform fashion by all departments. The Prime Minister has therefore decided to commission a review to establish the position across government on the annual release of papers and the ability and readiness of departments to meet the requirements of moving from a 30 to 20-year rule, including the processes for withholding information. This review will be carried out by the Prime Minister's Independent Advisor on Ministerial Standards, Sir Alex Allen. Nothing can undo, Mr. Speaker, the loss of life and the suffering caused by the tragic events at Sri Harmandir Sahib. It is quite right that the concerns that were raised about UK involvement have been investigated. It is a strength of our democracy that we are always prepared to take an unflinching look at the past. But I hope this investigation and the open manner in which it has been conducted will provide reassurance to the Sikh community, to this House and to the public, and in that spirit I present it to the House.
My Lords, I start by thanking the Noble Baroness, the Minister, for reading the statement made in another place by her honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary. It's clearly a matter of considerable interest to this House. One can see that by just looking around on all sides. And of course there will be people, members of this, our honourable members, noble members of this House, who were involved at that particular time, either in opposition or in government or in some way. So it's a matter of considerable interest to this House, and we're grateful to the Noble Baroness. My Lords, the raid in 1984 on the Golden Temple complex, called Operation Blue Star, did result, as the Noble Baroness has already told us, in hundreds of deaths, devastating damage to the temple, and rising levels of sectarian violence, and which also ultimately saw the assassination of Indira Gandhi, India's Prime Minister, later that same year. We welcome what light the report sheds on the British government's alleged involvement with these events, and we also welcome the fact that some of the key documents relating to this event and the British government's alleged involvement have now been published. There are still some serious questions to be asked about the involvement, conduct and contribution of the British authorities, perhaps going to the highest level, in the events that surrounded the storming of the Golden Temple and that cost so many innocent lives. So I want to ask, if I may, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, a few questions around that topic. Has the government made public all the documents it intends to make public about this incident? We are grateful, of course, for the documentation in the annex to the Cabinet Secretary's report. But if there are other documents that are relevant, may I ask the Noble Lady why they have not been published and whether there is any intention to publish them in the future. Given that the report cites officials interviewed over the course of the investigation, will the government commit to publishing a list of those officials, and if not, why not? We know from exchanges in another place that ministers at the time have been interviewed and spoken to about this matter by the Cabinet Secretary while compiling his report. Can she just confirm that that is the position? And can she confirm whether their testimony might be made public or not? I move on to the terms of the investigation led by the Cabinet Secretary. And we welcome very much the fact that following representations by the Sikh community, the Cabinet Secretary published a letter that detailed the scope of his inquiry. But can the Noble Lady explain to this House why there was over a 3-week delay in publishing the terms of reference? And can she further clarify whether the terms of the inquiry actually changed while the inquiry was taking place. The terms of reference, as published in a letter from the Cabinet Office on the 1st of February, didn't include specific reference to the time period covered by the investigation. Yet the final report that we've seen today sets out a time frame of December 1983 to June 1984. Why was this time frame not made public earlier on in the process? Many, both inside and outside Parliament, have expressed regret that the investigation seems to cover only the first part of 1984, given the enormous significance of events in the weeks and then the months after June 1984, and their direct link to the storming of the Golden Temple. So my question to the Noble Lady is this: will the government ask the Cabinet Secretary to set out whether he believes there could be some grounds for a fuller inquiry covering a longer period? Let me turn briefly to the substance of the findings in the report. There is, and I quote directly from the Cabinet Secretary's review, no record of any assistance to the June 1984 operation called Blue Star by the Indian government, other than the limited military advice provided in mid-February. End of quote. Can the Noble Lady, the Minister, set out whether the nature of that limited military advice provided earlier that year rules out conclusively the possibility that the British government offered support for Operation Blue Star in the form that it was eventually undertaken? From the documents that have been presented today, and I'm referring in one particular, the 23rd of February 1984, from the Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary, to the Principal Private Secretary at number 10, this is said, with his own experience, that's talking about the military advisor in question, with his own experience in a study of this kind of problem, he was able to advise the Indians of a realistic and workable plan, which Mrs. Gandhi approved on her return from Moscow on the 16th of February. I wonder if the Noble Lady can comment on that point. My Lords, the report sets out that there's been a quick analysis in recent weeks by current UK military staff, which confirms that there were differences between the June operation and the advice from the UK military officer in February. Indeed, the Noble Baroness, in repeating the statement, mentioned some of those differences. Why was this analysis as quick as it was, and is there any point in perhaps having a rather longer analysis to see what the position is? My Lords, everyone in this House is aware, of course, of the continuing pain felt by the Sikh community around the world, not least in this country, at those events and the deaths and the destruction they caused. But also the anti-Sikh violence following the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and the emergency period that followed, which saw arbitrary arrests, accusations of torture, rape and disappearances, some of them still unresolved today. Well, of course, there are differences within the Sikh community itself over the issue of a separate Sikh state. There is unanimity in their horror at these events, and for British Sikhs, particularly perhaps, over recent years, the added burden that their own government may have been involved in these actions. So we believe, and does the government agree, that they have a continuing responsibility to address the widespread concerns and fears that do still exist. If, of course, they are able to provide answers to those concerns and questions, then we, as Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, will of course support them in that effort.
My Lords, Lords, can I start by thanking a number of noble lords who have discussed this matter with me over the last few weeks, and indeed the opposition for making sure that they played a part really in the discussions that took place to make sure all the concerns of the British Sikh community and the wider community were brought to bear when the report was being prepared. I would urge noble lords to read the report and the documentation attached to the report, because it does go into so much detail, and my statement really is in no way as good as the actual report and reading of the documentation, which I think will shed greater light on what was happening at that time. I hope I have assured noble lords today, however, of the basic questions that have been asked as this report has been prepared about the UK's involvement, about the extent of the advice that was given, about how material that advice was. I hope noble lords are assured about the amount of documentation that has been considered during this report. I can assure the noble lord that documentation that we intend to make public has been made public, but of course we can never guarantee what documentation may come to light in future years as part of disclosure, but I have informed the House as the extent of the documentation that was considered in the preparation of this report. In relation to officials, my lords, the Cabinet Secretary and officials spoke in the course of the investigation to individuals who were associated with the two documents. Some officials, however, now are deceased, and therefore we had to consider the documentation only. I'm sure noble lords would accept that it is right to protect their anonymity at this stage, and this is actually in line with standard government procedure. So we don't intend to name the officials interviewed, nor do we intend to disclose the transcripts. The noble lord asked in relation to the terms of reference during the investigation. The terms of reference, my lords, were set out by the Prime Minister in the House in the other place during PMQs on the 15th of January. He focused on establishing the facts about the UK's involvement. They were to look at why the government provided advice to the Indian authorities, the nature of the UK assistance, and the impact of that assistance. The review terms of reference were not narrowed in any way, indeed were widened to take account of some of the areas of concerns that were being raised, and these were included to ensure that these further concerns too were addressed. There was no delay, my lords, in publishing the terms of reference. We were not committed to publish these from the outset, but decided to do so given questions being asked about this point. My lords, I would say that the inquiry was thorough, the inquiry was quick, it was important because questions were being asked. I'm not sure whether noble lords spend time watching the ethnic Sky media channels in the way that I do, but if anybody watches any of the Sky channels, Sikh TV, Sangat TV, this has been a constant point of discussion within the British Sikh community for many, many weeks. It was why the government felt it was appropriate to deal with this matter as swiftly as possible. My lords, in relation to a longer analysis, I think it's right to go back to what it is that the Cabinet Secretary was asked to look at, and that was in relation to the UK involvement. I have no doubt about the strength of feeling within the British Sikh community, and indeed in the Sikh community in the wider world. These events are still raw. These events are still part of a discussion amongst young Sikhs who were not even born at the time that this tragedy occurred. And of course, as we approach the 30 years, it becomes even more of an issue. But it is not for the British government to be involved in the matters which I think clearly noble lords would accept were sovereign matters for the Indian state. This report was never about reopening the Operation Blue Star. It was about looking at UK involvement, and I hope I've assured noble lords of our role in that.
My lord, may I thank my noble friend for repeating his statement, and may I also ask her to extend the thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for the open and transparent way in which he has carried out this particular investigation. My lords, no matter where we stood at the time of the attack on Harminder Sahib, the Golden Temple, it is very clear that the revelation has created a shock to almost all the Sikh community, not only here, but worldwide. The Golden Temple, the highest temple, the holiest temple, which many of us have visited, is a place of tranquility and peace. It has the deepest significance to the Sikh community And all over the world, as you rightly pointed out, the matter is being discussed about our involvement there. The Prime Minister visited Amritsar, the Golden Temple, but he also visited, next to Amritsar, a Golden Temple, the Jallianwala Bagh, where, as members would as colleagues would recollect, that there was a massacre of a large number of Indians committed on the orders of General Dyer. And the Prime Minister was good enough to offer an apology at that particular stage. Even at this late stage, my lords, should we not give and extend some regret about our involvement in this particular episode at that particular time? And the second point I want to raise, my lords, is even at this late stage, and with this broad statement that is before us, would the Minister undertake not only to discuss this with the colleagues who are going to come and see her from the Sikh community, but make sure that this goes to every Gurdwara in this country so that they are aware about the depth with which this investigation was carried out and precisely what happened at that particular time in relation to our involvement.
I hear clearly what my noble friend has to say, and indeed I had the privilege of being the first minister in this current government to visit Sri Harmandir Sahib and also to visit Jallianwala Bagh, which of course the tragedy of 1919 is still something which certainly when I visited as somebody of who has origins in those lands was an incredibly emotional and poignant moment. But, my lords, I think I would take us back to what it is that we are talking about here. What the Prime Minister said and did in relation to Jallianwala Bagh is of course because there was a terrible, tragic massacre in which the United Kingdom was completely involved. I think what we're talking about here is a situation which involved the Indian forces, and the question that I had to present at this dispatch box was what was the UK involvement, and I hope that through the statement and through the documentation that has now been published I have made clear the UK involvement. And I would submit, my lords, that apologies go with responsibility. And in this particular case, my lords, the responsibility does not lie with the British government. I completely understand the sentiment which is there within the British Sikh community and indeed within the wider community. But I do not feel that this is the kind of case which could have any comparison, certainly as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, with Jallianwala Bagh. In relation to the wider point the Noble Lord makes about engagement with the British Sikh community, I enjoy a good relationship with the British Sikh community as Minister both in the Foreign Office and in the Department for Local Government, Communities and Local Government. It is a relationship we engage with regularly, both through Sikh communities coming to the department and engaging, but also through visits. Only a few months ago I was at the Nishkam Centre in Birmingham. It is a relationship that we place huge value upon. We note the huge contribution that Sikh communities are making, not just in the economic field and in the professions, but in volunteering, something that I hold incredibly dear and something which is so apparent when you visit places like the Nishkam Centre and other temples. My honourable friend, the Minister with responsibility for India, Hugo Swire, is meeting the Sikh community. Indeed, the meeting I think is taking place now as we speak, and it's probably why the Noble Lord Singh isn't in his seat, because he's probably at that meeting. I was hoping that this statement may have been taken at 5 o'clock, which would allow me to have been present. I was intending to be at that meeting, but I will certainly follow it up with a further meeting with the community.
My noble friend Lord Singh has asked me to express his regrets to the Noble Baroness, the Minister, and to the House that he can't be present in his place, given that he's followed this issue with assiduousness and determination over a very long time, but he is at the meeting that the Noble Baroness has just alluded to. She will have seen the statement made by Amrit Singh, the chairman of the Sikh Federation, that he was, his words, hugely disappointed with the inquiry's, his words, narrow terms, and that his meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Jeremy Haywood, had failed to assuage his concerns. Given that she has done so much to build good relationships with the Sikh community, will she give the House an assurance that she'll be willing to meet with Mr. Singh to discuss whether or not there are outstanding issues that could still be examined? And will she also comment briefly on the remark she made about Britain's commercial interests when she repeated the Foreign Secretary's statement earlier, and she said that they had played no part at all in any of these events? Would she be willing to publish a list of any arms deals that were made during the period prior to and immediately after these events in 1984.
The Noble Lord makes important points, and I think Amrit Singh is actually part of the delegation of individual organisations and individuals who are meeting with Minister Swire. If that is not happening and he isn't part of that meeting, then certainly I will see if appropriate contact could be made. And I, as I said, will be making contact myself with members of the Sikh community in the coming weeks and months. There is a wide range of opinion. I had the opportunity to discuss the matter in some length with Lord Singh, and indeed my honourable friend Paul Uppal, who is the only member of Parliament of Sikh origin in the House of Commons, and I had quite a breadth of opinion which came back from the Sikh community about how far the British government is expected to go to satisfy certain elements of the community. I completely take on board how raw this issue is, how raw the issue of Operation Blue Star is, how far certain elements of the community wish for there to be a truth and reconciliation process. But that, Noble Lords, I would say goes back to what I said at the beginning. That is a separate issue to the issue that we are dealing with, which is what was the UK's involvement. I can assure the Noble Lord that this was the advice that was given was not linked in any way to commercial interest, not linked in any way to a particular defence contract or a particular defence negotiation. That's certainly what the documentation is showing. I'm not sure how much further it would take the matter by starting to publish any sort of discussions that were happening at the time in relation to any sort of commercial activity with the state over what period of time. I know from my own dealings with countries that we're engaging with through UKTI, these matters can sometimes take months, sometimes take years. How far would that net have to be cast? What I think I'd like to be assured of, and what I'd like to reassure the House about, was what was there in this particular case a commercial connection to this particular decision, and I can assure Noble Lords that there wasn't.
My Lords, I rise to mention that my noble friend the Minister outlined that the processes regarding information not being disclosed are going to be the subject of a further inquiry. Looking at the statement from the government, it appears that it was fortuitous that certain documents were actually copied into other departmental files, and that actually at the Ministry of Defence's review at 25 years, the whole file was destroyed. We are grateful for that, what appears to be fortuitous copying of the documents, but is that the correct implication here? That without that there wouldn't have been a comprehensive file retained for the conclusions of this inquiry to be based upon? And how is that going to be part of the ongoing inquiry when that review presumably will now be being done by the Ministry of Defence at 15 years for a 20-year release of information? And could that be part of that ongoing process, please?
I'm sure these are matters which will be looked at. My noble friend will be aware that this government is hugely committed to the issue of transparency, and it's why we've brought in the 20-year rule, bringing it down from 30 years. It is important that documentation, of course subject to national intelligence issues and national security interests, documentation is put out into the public domain. This particular document that was destroyed was part of a 25-year review. Of course, as my noble friend says, it was fortuitous that elements of that document were present in other departments, but I'm sure lessons will be learned from this incident.
My Lord, the Noble Baroness was quite correct in saying that the Operation Blue Star was the responsibility of the Indian government. But there have been reports in the press that the advice given by the military advisor to the government of India was not to undertake an operation such as Blue Star, but wait the people out who were in the temple, and as it were, settle the issue much less violently than was the case. Has there been any evidence unearthed to confirm that? And if so, would it not be to the advantage of all concerned to make that public?
The Noble Lord may have heard in my statement that I did say that the advice that was given was that the entering of the temple should be really seen as a last resort, and a negotiated settlement would have been the right way and the first way to proceed in these matters. I think in any event it's clear that as to what the advice was that was given from the British officer, but it's also clear that that advice wasn't followed. And I think that was also an important element of the Cabinet Secretary's report.
I was the Prime Minister's principal private secretary at the time of these events. One of the documents that's published today is the letter from the Foreign Secretary's office seeking the Prime Minister's assent on the 3rd of February to the sending out of a military advisor. While it's clear from the extent of the Prime Minister's underlinings on that letter that she considered this proposal very carefully, will the noble Lady the Minister confirm that beyond giving her assent and asking to be kept informed of subsequent developments, the Prime Minister took no initiative and made no other action in relation to this matter between March and June when the military action took place?
That certainly appears to be the case, and of course if the Noble Lord's reading and recollection is of that being the case, then certainly I would take his word on that.
My Lords, in addition to the point which Lord Desire made that using force to resolve these situations is nearly always counterproductive and has results that you don't anticipate, are there two other lessons from this? And firstly, that the speed with which this report's been produced is actually commendable. I think of the Chilcot inquiry we're still waiting for. This has been done in a few weeks, and it does seem to me to be a lesson for other situations where a bit more speed can actually help the reconciliation process. But finally, it's one of the lessons that understanding religious sensitivities is something the modern world can find hard to do. One thinks of Ariel Sharon going onto the Temple Mount, starting the Second Intifada, and all the consequences that have flowed from that. Is that a lesson that we should draw from these events?
Of course, and I thank the Right Reverend Prelate for his warm words in relation to the way in which this report was and this inquiry was conducted quickly. It was certainly part of the clear remit that the Prime Minister set at the outset. The Right Reverend Prelate makes an important point that to try and understand the sentiment within the British Sikh community, it is important to understand the significance of Sri Harmandir Sahib, to understand the significance of the timing of Operation Blue Star, the implications in relation to the damage that was done to Sri Harmandir Sahib, the basis of some of the concerns that were being raised by the dissidents. So the Right Reverend Prelate makes an important point that sometimes the challenge that I have in an ever sometimes aggressively secular world, some of these sensitivities are not properly explored and understood.
My Lord, does the Noble Baroness consider that the destruction of some of the principal documents in this matter and the fortuitous recovery of the contents of some of the documents by reason of the fact that copies were made indicates that a review should be conducted of the rules for the destruction of documents, since these matters could have been lost to posterity if it had not been for the copies that were made.
I think I alluded to that in my repeat of the statement, where I said that we were determined to look at the wider issues which these events presented about the management and the release of information by government, and of course the management of how documentation is held and how it's destroyed, and I'll certainly make sure that the views of my noble friend are fed into them.
Can the noble lady help me? Has the actual advice that was given by the British military to the Indian government been unearthed? I mean, is that one of the documents that has been discovered fortuitously, and if so, has it been published? Presumably the Indian government might still have a copy of that advice. It might have gone and been copied inside Whitehall to heaven knows how many departments. If the document exists, does she not think that perhaps it would be a good idea to publish it?
think as the Noble Lord was speaking, I'm going through the documentations that have been published, and there was a note of the advice that was given, and I'm not sure whether that is part of the documentation that is published, but I'll certainly check that again. But I would say to the Noble Lord, do go back and read the report and look at the documentation. It may well be that the information is actually in there. I've seen so much documentation in relation to this matter over the last 3 weeks that I'm starting to lose track of exactly which bits of it I've seen where.
Lords, both the Noble Baroness, the Minister, and the Noble Lord D'Arcio have referred to the Amritsar massacre of 1919. Does the Noble Baroness accept that this House is very intimately and embarrassingly connected with that massacre? In that after the massacre, a resolution was passed in this House, I believe unanimously, congratulating Brigadier General Dyer on his distinguished conduct. Has the time not now come, and I appreciate, of course, the apology made by the Prime Minister very properly some time ago, but has the time not now come when that blot on the escutcheon of this noble and honourable House should be removed?
I think, my Lords, that particular discussion would go beyond the remit of the statement that I'm doing today. I think I can go back to saying what I said before, which is I had an opportunity to visit Jallianwala Bagh. I think in many ways it's probably much more personal to me than it is to maybe other Noble Lords in this House. It was deeply connected to it in terms of my own family connections back to the Punjab. But I think that what the Prime Minister did in both visiting Jallianwala Bagh and in saying the words that he said meant a lot to people, certainly to my grandparents, my grandmother who is still alive. And history always judges matters in a different way, but I think the Prime Minister has certainly tried to put the record straight.
House to be in committee on the water bill, Lord de Morney.
My Lords, I beg to move that the House do now resolve itself into a committee upon the bill.
The question is that the House do now resolve itself into a committee upon the bill. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The country not content, the contents have it. The question is that the title of the bill be postponed. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The country not content, the contents have it. In Clause 1, Amendment 1, Lord Whitty.